Okay, so it's AP European History with Dr. Brovkin. Today's topic is Thomas More and his famous book Utopia. So, as you know, Thomas More was a chancellor during the time of Henry VIII. Politically, he was a staunch Catholic. He was a friend of Erasmus. He was one of the most educated men of his life, and he wrote a book, which is probably one of the most famous books of all time. And it probably gave birth to something we call today socialism and communism, among other things, and Christian socialism. It was written at the same age as The Prince by Machiavelli, and it's probably just as popular and just as important. So let's have a brief look at this book, Utopia, and what he is trying to say. It was written in 1516. It was published in Latin, and basically, like most books of the time, it was published in Latin, and it was translated in Italian and Spanish and German way before it came out in English edition, which appeared only in 1550 something, which was after his death. So it was not widely known while he was still alive. But when it was published in English, it had a tremendous impact. In a sense, one could say it gave rise to some extent to a movement called Puritanism, or a true English reformation. So Utopia is like a story of a travel account. It's as if he's traveling somewhere in the world, and this is, of course, the time of great exploration. This is the after Columbus. This is the in fact, he knew Amerigo Vespucci, who discovered and made a map of America, so he was aware of all these discoveries. So it's like an island somewhere out there. And the first title of the book was Nowhere, if you translate it. But then somebody advised him to call it Utopia, and that's what he said it would be. It's an account of life on some kind of island, as if it actually exists, and it's a travel account what life is like in that nowhere island, how people live there. So the key words here are in common. That will become very, very important for England and for America. All property is held in common. That already is sort of implication is, if you continue this thought, and we will, it's going to lead us to communism. Basically, property, way before Proudhon in 19th century, Thomas More says property is theft. Property leads to corruption of human mind. Property makes people greedy, divisive, and leads them to exploit one another. Here's a great quote about the way people act, and here's a quote: "They invent and devise all means and crafts how to hire and abuse the labor of the poor for as little money as may be." And that, of course, is supposedly about Utopia, but it's not, because people don't live like that in Utopia. This is his critique of contemporary England. The rich take advantage of the poor and devise all kinds of means to get there, to take advantage of them, to hire them for less than what they deserve, or to get their property, as was the case indeed in England, when they would push out the peasants and get their fields for sheep and then produce wool, and that was the beginning of English textile industry and industrialization. So he's an acute observer of life in England, and that is why he's writing a book about life as it is in some kind of island. So what is life like? We can divide his discussion into several subcategories, which would be, let's start with economy. The economy is in common, which means everybody works, and then they share, they contribute everything into a common kitty, so to speak, and they divide up the results of their labor into common use. Now, again, one could make an extrapolation and say that if you look at the Israeli kibbutz of the 1950s, that's pretty much the way it was. This is pretty much the way it was. People would work together, everything would be in common, just like Thomas More said, except that they would have their families, their houses, their children would be with them, but there's no money. Everything is divided in common. So in a sense, you could say that it's a pretty close example of how Thomas More meant it in an Israeli kibbutz of the 1950s. The principle that he actually articulates is that everybody contributes and everybody gets to according to his needs. Now, if you look at the Communist Party documents of the Soviet Union, the communism is defined as from everybody according to his ability and to everybody according to his needs. So in other words, the official program of communism is based on pretty much the words of Thomas More, not Marx. No money, there's no money. You basically work and you get your share from the common good. So this is economy. Morality. There is no cheating, there's no stealing, there's no property, there is no violence, there's no coercion. Basically, it's a brotherly community of Christians. It's a brotherly community of people who believe in God. He actually doesn't say it Christians. He basically will come back to the issue of tolerance. But the morality is based on belief in God as the provider of justice. Family life. There's one wife, and she obeys the husband, and they raise children together. Essentially, monogamy is the principle. But women have rights, and especially they have a right of divorce. Divorce is allowed for adultery and for mutual consent, which is new, totally new for the time. Yeah, divorce for adultery was already established at that time. The Pope had to agree to it, but mutual consent is a new idea. So it's a new idea because it gives a new kind of right and respect and recognition of the personality of a woman. She can initiate the divorce not because of infidelity, but because they don't want to live together anymore. This is a modern idea, way too modern for 1500s, that mutual consent is a grounds for divorce, just like in contemporary society. Education. Education is free and education is for all. I mean, it's so simple. This is like in a contemporary society, advanced society, especially West European society, not American ones, one where you have to pay $50,000 to get education in the university. In Europe, it is still pretty much free, and that is again Thomas More. This is a totally new idea. The only schools that there were at that time were church schools, and universal education for children wouldn't be introduced until 18th century. 18th century in Austria, Germany, and England would be the last. So this is a very revolutionary idea to have education for all, for free, at the expense of the whole community. And finally, we go to religion. What about religion? The key idea here is tolerance. He is again way ahead of his time, because Europe is going to enter what we call the century of religious wars, and tens of thousands of people are going to be killed. England would not be an exclusion to that, especially among the Catholics in Ireland, who would be slaughtered. Thomas More, before all that horrible stuff happened, but he probably already, no, he was before, it was before even the German events. It's 1515, it's even before Luther's 96 points. It's before anything happened. He basically says, unless you have tolerance, you have a war of all against all. He kind of predicted this outcome. So everybody is free, he says, whatever religion, including, presumably, Judaism and Islam, whatever religion you want, with one exception. The only people that are not tolerated are atheists. You have to believe in God. That's a requirement. If you're not, you're expelled. You're not killed. You're not burned. You're expelled from the community. Pretty much like it was supposed to be in Geneva, but Calvin violated that by killing Servetus. So, what is the outcome? The outcome was immense popularity of the book, but also it had a following, and there was two kinds of long-term followers. One, you could say, religious socialism, and from that point of view, English Puritanism was tremendously influenced by Thomas More, and they believed in this kind of life. And moreover, when the Puritans went to America on Mayflower ship, the kind of a community they organized in Massachusetts is very much along the lines of Thomas More, which was a religious community of brothers and sisters. They did have property though, but even today, if you come to Boston, in the middle of Boston there is a garden that's called Commons. Moreover, in any New England town, in Worcester, in many other places, there's a space in the middle which is called the Commons. Very few people realize the origin of the Commons is Thomas More. That was a field held as property in common, together. It was communal property where people could have access to pasture of their domestic animals in common. So this was a long-term effect. And of course the morality. You could also say the morality of the Puritans, the modesty, the loyalty, the lack of flamboyant dresses, the family life, devotion to one wife, all these Protestant values of English Puritans that had such a tremendous impact on New England and on the United States is, of course, Thomas More. And then there is this non-religious, or you could say secular, follow-up to his ideas, and that, of course, is the entire tradition of socialism and communism. It was obviously the idea that the rich exploit the poor and pay them as little as possible, was further explored later on by Proudhon and by Karl Marx, and the result of that was a totally new teaching, which was the Communist Manifesto, which actually said property is theft, and you have to organize society as a communal, non-property based association of people without God, though. This was Marx's contribution, that is now known as European socialism. Thank you.